The Great Grumbler and the Wonder Tree by Margaret Mahy. Mrs. Finch was a good gardener, and Mr. Finch was a great grumbler. Whenever Mrs. Finch grew something and cooked it for his tea, Mr. Finch always said he would rather have something else. When she cooked carrots, he said he would rather have cabbage. When she cooked cabbage, he sighed and asked for corn. He said yuck to her parsnips and poof to her pumpkins. Mrs. Finch went to Gretel the garden witch. "My husband is a great grumbler," she said. "Nothing I grow is good enough for him." "I'll give you a seed which will settle that," said Gretel. "It's hard to grow, but you are a good gardener. It's the seed of the Wonder Tree. Mind you, it's not free. You'll have to pay me with a trailer load of turnips." "Right," said Mrs. Finch. "I'll bring them over with my tractor at 2 o'clock this afternoon." Gretel gave the seed to Mrs. Finch. On the seed there was a poem in tiny gold letters. "Feed me, weed me, water me well. What will I grow to? Who can tell?" Mrs. Finch planted the Wonder Tree seed by her back door. She fed it well, she watered it well, and she weeded it very well. By the next day it had grown 2 leaves. By the next month it had grown 2 branches. By the next month it had grown into a big tree. At the bottom of its trunk was an oven door. Halfway up its trunk was a little silver tap. In among its leaves were tiny saucepans. Otherwise, it was just an ordinary tree. Very strange ordinary tree. One day, Mr. Finch looked at his dinner and sighed. "Oh dear, mashed potato and gravy," he said. "I grew those potatoes in my own garden," said Mrs. Finch. "Well, I don't like to grumble," said Mr. Finch, grumbling, "but I do wish you had grown pumpkins. I would have loved some pumpkin soup." It was not the right time of year for pumpkins. However, Mrs. Finch took a saucepan and went and stood under the Wonder Tree. "I watered you well when you started to droop. Please, dear tree, give pumpkin soup." A rustling, leafy voice replied, "Pumpkin soup for a grumbler's tea. Turn the tap in the trunk of the tree." Mrs. Finch turned the tap. Out came pumpkin soup, which filled the saucepan. "What's this?" cried Mr. Finch. "Pumpkin soup? I was just thinking how nice Silverbeet would be." Man, I don't like this guy. Mrs. Finch went out to the Wonder Tree. "I fed you, watered you, weeded your feet. Please, dear tree, give Silverbeet." The tree replied, "Greens for dinner, a tasty treat. Pick off a saucepan for Silverbeet." Mrs. Finch picked a saucepan. It was full of beautifully cooked Silverbeet. Mr. Finch was quite upset at having his grumble spoiled. "Oh dear," he said, "it's funny, but now I feel like having a good beef stew." Mrs. Finch went back to the Wonder Tree. "I weeded and watered and fed you too. Please, dear tree, give good beef stew." The tree replied in its rustling leafy voice, "Open my oven door, quickly do, and you will find a good beef stew." Mr. Finch could hardly believe his eyes. He took up his knife and fork and began to eat. As he did this, a voice said, "Hey, I was here first. You've got to eat me first." It was the pumpkin soup. "And me next," said the Silverbeet. "This food is talking to me," cried Mr. Finch in surprise. "Eat me," screamed the soup crossly. "Don't keep me waiting. You're wasting my time." Mr. Finch was afraid. "Yes, sir," he said. I'll eat you at once." "And then eat me," said the sweet Silverbeet sternly. Mr. Finch ate his pumpkin soup and his Silverbeet. You've let me get cold, grumbled the big beef stew. But you've got to eat me all the same, and then you've got to do the dishes. Mr. Finch had to eat the beef stew. By then he was very full. He was too full, but he had to do the dishes. While Mr. Finch was doing the dishes, Mrs. Finch went out to the wonder tree and watered it carefully. She gave it lovely leaf mould and weeded around its toes. "You're a good friend to me," she said. "I can see he won't do much more grumbling with you to help me." And neither he did. The end. Nice story, Margaret Mahy, famous New Zealand writer. Very impressed. I understand why people like you. The end.